Sean Wensley, it is a delight and a pleasure to have you back again. I rarely have authors back on the show, but you are a man and a doctor with so much knowledge, so much compassion, so much value for all of us to think about all the animals in the sky and the land and the sea that we interact with and do it in ignorance a lot of the time. Your book, Through a Vet's Eyes, is one of the most amazing books I've ever read, not just because of all the ways you open our eyes, but your lyrical writing, and particularly it's about birds. And you started your animal passion about birds when you were a young vet. You can talk about that for a minute. Anyone who didn't hear our earlier conversation, please go back either to the podcast platform you listen on or on TRACIE'S.com. You'll find on Dog Talk, just put in Dr. Sean Wensley and you'll find our earlier conversation. It's so illuminating and fun. Sean, those finches really started you to be a thinker and a watcher of animals, didn't it?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back, Tracy. Really appreciate it. Yeah, no, for sure. As I mentioned last time, I came into wanting to be a vet through my love of natural history and nature and being out in nature. I was fortunate to grow up near pine woods and coastal dunes. I made the most of that and was very much shaped by it. I used to love watching wild birds in those habitats, whether
Yes.
they were up in the tops of the pine trees, foraging for little insects or what have you, or then out on the coast, out at the shore. We had many pink-footed geese would migrate in from Iceland each autumn, hooper swans and other wading birds making their fabulous journeys across the globe and gracing us with their presence momentarily. So that certainly attuned me to watching animals, you're right, and just observing them, observing their
Yes.
behavior, being out there on my own, stopping with binoculars and seeing how their behavior changes at different times and that sort of thing. And the bit about the zebra finches, that links that passion then and that interest, my time working in a pet shop where we looked after the various animals that were available for sale. This is again when I was a teenager,
Right.
shaping my thoughts. I'm sure we looked after them, but they were in small, barren cages. They just had their drinker, their feeder, and maybe three perchers. And these little zebra finches that you mentioned, they're native to Australia, as indeed the more familiar budgies, but they're very common as pets. I thought, despite this care that we're giving them, life still seems a little bit incomplete for them, and I
Yes.
wondered how they're really faring. I was fortunate when I was then at vet school to receive some funding from a charity in one of my vet school holidays. And so I had 70 zebra finches with that funding in little cages that replicated the pet shop. And through sitting for many hours on a ladder in front of them so that they got used to my being there. Unlike in the pet shop, when you approach the cage and they all stop what they're doing, they freeze and they watch
Right.
you and they wait for you to go away. These little ones, with only me to disturb them, eventually got used to my being there and proceeded to behave as they would if I wasn't there. And it was revealing in ways that, in some ways, were troubling. They were very aggressive to each other, they pecked each other's feathers. Some of them developed so called stereotypic behavior, which is abnormal, repetitive behavior.
Right.
So some went round, and that was called route tracing. And some of them, and I found this in the literature, it had been previously observed a number of years earlier. There's only one published paper I could find. They had this stereotypic spot pecking. So it was coupled with abnormal route tracing, but then they would stop and just peck at one spot at the back of the cage. They would just go at that one spot, and then they'd start again round and round, peck, 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 round. And these are just abnormal behaviors that develop because of the inadequacy living environment, despite the fact that they're loved and cared for.
Yes, and we people think we're loving and caring for all kinds of animals that are living in our homes or in stalls attached to our houses or perhaps in a barn elsewhere or in fields. And I wanted to come back to the book because your chapter on horses is so disturbing to those of us who love horses, have kept horses, have ridden horses. And that's whether it's just a trail ride that you've been on, which there's lots of in America. And there's lots of trail riding in England and Wales. I remember going on a trail ride in Wales when I was a teenager myself and going to riding school in England in the countryside. And supposedly everything was at the highest standard of care. which it was from the way humans think of it. And then performance horses in America, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. And I did show jumping and equitation, but was right near the dressage barns as well. And you write about these horses and the psychological and physical misery we put every single kept horse through, and none of us ever stops to think about it. And those of you listening who love horses and you have horses or you had horses, it's very illuminating and important to read a non-judgmental but seen from the eyes of a veterinarian with great compassion view of what that horse's life is like. And you talk in that chapter about some of the vices of horses. All of us have, if you're around horses at all, and I think lots of people listening to the show, because dog and cat people are also horse people, we know about cribbers, horses who bite the edge of fence, even if it's a small out pasture where they are all alone, which they shouldn't be because they're a herd animal, or particularly in the stall. And talk a little bit, Sean, about what you discovered and realized, and the veterinary world has discovered, but not illuminated we owners, by the way, as to what causes cribbing. I remember even cribbing collars. Oh, this horse has a terrible habit. It's all about him. He's just like a bad horse. We're going to put a collar that basically chokes him every time he tries to grab onto the edge of the stall with his teeth and crib. I don't know if you had them in England. We
Mm.
had them in America. And so, talk a little bit about the natural world of a horse and what we've done to make their life so unnatural, including colic and ulcers, which I personally had a horse with suffering from that. And reading your chapter, I thought, oh my God, we were doing it to all the horses, just Limo showed it. And so he got the medication, but we should have changed his life. Tell us
Mm.
about horses and England being such a horsey country and America much less, but the enclaves of horse ownership and performing and leisurely activities with horses are pretty much from coast to coast and everywhere down the middle as well. So tell us how wrong we've gone in terms of what we do with to horses.
Thank you, Tracy. Yeah, I'm really pleased that you picked up on the horse chapter because as the book covers lots of different areas
Yes,
where we areas of human use of animals where we have come to find that life isn't what we expected from the animals' perspectives. And whilst farm animals get a lot of attention, and rightly there are so many of them, horses are, I think, underserved and
yes.
under discussed. So thank you. And I'm also grateful that you mentioned it's non-judgmental. So for anyone that it might be worrying that this is a really depressing and finger-waggy
No,
book, then
right.
I appreciate you mentioning that it certainly doesn't aim to be. And I just want to relay what we now know. But yeah, there are estimated some 60 million horses worldwide. Many of those be working equids in certain parts of the world, horses that are ploughing fields and
Right,
transporting people and doing difficult work where people are experiencing difficult lives as well. Historically, in other parts of the world, US, Great Britain, Europe, we've used horses a lot in the military, of course, and they have
right.
quite a status and quite a
Yes,
standing. And now they're predominantly in these parts of the world used for pleasure. So you've mentioned dressage and showing and racing, and indeed just being horse that we enjoy
right,
riding for our leisure. The recurring theme in the book, as we've just talked about with the zebra finches, is the understanding that those beautiful, sensitive animals that we so love being around have been domesticated for around 6,000 years, but they had wild ancestor. They've come from wild relatives.
yes,
And whilst we've selected them for certain traits that were useful and desirable for us, so for in the case of a racehorse, the ability to run very
yes,
quickly, they're extremely athletic. In selecting for those certain traits, they nevertheless retain a very significant portion of the traits that they evolved to have in the wild. And so what that means is that a horse fundamentally, despite being in a stable, as many of them are, most of them are, is still at it in its essence and in its physiology and in its motivation and its psychology. An animal that wants to be with other horses, they're very
right,
social, they're herd animals. They've evolved to graze continuously for about 16 out of 24 hours every day. And we could just come back to that because it
That's
really
right.
does impact on there's a physiological aspect to that as well. And they want to roam and be able to move over large areas. And so when we restrict each of those three things, really, so we often stable them and subject them to social isolation.
Right.
We often restrict their turnout so that they spend many hours in their small stable, which is just a little box essentially. And we give them a kind of high energy, low fiber diet, again, typically, which is at odds with what they've evolved to eat. And the prop that you mentioned, the medication I think your horse had, and so there would be a high prevalence amongst horses of having stomach ulcers, gastric ulcers,
Yes.
which we know from ourselves as people creates a sort of burning sensation and is really
Yes.
quite unpleasant. The reason that so many 80 to 100 between 80 to 100% of racehorses in training have gastric ulcers, which are we attempt to manage them with medication. But the reason they've got them, or a key risk factor for them having them, is that they have this low fiber diet, so the stomach continues to produce gastric acid, stomach
Yes.
acid. So if they were grazing for 16 out of 24 hours, which their body is expecting them to do, and each time they graze, then the fiber is absorbing that acid. So it's not just sitting in the
Right.
stomach, it's getting absorbed by the grass and the other fibrous material. And also, when they chew, alkaline saliva is stimulated, and that goes down and helps neutralize it. So they would normally be just trickle feeding, as we call it, just grazing, grazing,
Right.
and that steady flow of acid would be both getting neutralized by the spit and absorbed by the fiber. So then, as soon as we go to, I don't know, 2 meals a day, high energy, eat it quickly, and the rest of the day, the poor stomach is just continuing to produce that steady trickle of acid, and that is an extremely high risk for them for contributing to the gastric ulcers that we see. Also, though, as in people, there is a psychological aspect. So them being isolated and then
Yes.
being subjected to the stress of training, especially if they're in a very intense training regime, as
Yes.
some competition horses are, then you've got that link between, again, as in people, that link between stress, psychological stress, and gut health. So we do sadly see a lot of gastric ulcers.
And no relief for the stress. I think the racing industry, the horse racing industry, flat racing and other racing, has come under a great deal of scrutiny in the last 10 years because the horses break down on the track, particularly in America, where they race them much younger than in Europe. So their bones haven't fully formed or closed in lay medical terms. But we don't look at these other horses, the horses who are trail horses, show horses, um, and we don't stop and consider that when the horse has an ulcer. Now, my horse Limo was nearly colicky frequently, colic being a killer of horses and a great concern and fear about horses. But no one ever says, oh, it's the lifestyle that causing their gut to be in a royal. So what they figured out, and I thought, this is so nice. He's a delicate thoroughbred. So he needs this, I guess. I never thought, oh, it's his life that basically sucks because he's in a stall, whether it was the East Coast where there was a bit of grass turnout at least, but on the West Coast, there's no turnout. Southern California, the horses are in the stall 24, 23 hours a day. And for 1 hour a day, they're taken out, immediately saddled. And you also talk about horses with ulcers being girthy. We talk about horses having bad manners. You go to tighten
Mhm.
their girth and they whirl around and want to bite you or they kick out. It hurts
Mhm.
because their gut already hurts. I never knew that. So now we take them out, we put the bit in their mouth, we take them into a riding arena and immediately make them be obedient to us in that
Mhm.
1 hour a day that they're out of that stall. At some point in my life, someone pointed it out to me, and I could never see horse competition the same way again. And when
Mhm.
I moved the horse to the East Coast because I moved and there was grass turnout, it really didn't change the fact that he was turned out alone because, oh, they don't want the horses to hurt each other because they
Mhm.
aren't used to being with other horses. They might bite each other, they might kick each other, they might stumble. So they turn the horses out with rubber bell boots and all kinds of equipment and leather boots. And there's nothing normal about it. They're like little China dolls. And so my horse had to get crushed up human heavy duty ulcer medication the week before, the week during, and the week after competition, all crushed up and given to him with some oats. And I thought, this is nice. We're taking care of him. But what was the root cause? And this is
Yeah.
what your book, Through a Vet's Eyes, points out the ways in which animals have had to accommodate our selfish, thoughtless way of living with them. But we think they're pampered. They're so
Mm.
beautiful. Look at how many different blankets I have for my horse. I have one when it's cold, and I have one when it's wet, and I have one when it's somewhere in between. And there's
Mm.
grooms putting them on and off them all the time, let's say, at a very fancy level. And that's true of any of the Olympic equestrian horses or dressage horses. But there's nothing about that's natural for a horse. And their true nature of being should be out grazing all the time.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
that's right.
disturbing that no one is calling it out. And your book very gently and effectively points out the ways in which we're missing the point.
Yeah, and awareness is starting to grow. I'm forever I'm an optimist, and I think we're starting to see a lot more scrutiny now within the horse racing industry globally on the concept of social license to operate, they would call it. So the willingness of the public to support certain practices once they're revealed
Right.
to be, albeit unwittingly, harmful. In the book, I talk a lot about solutions wherever I can. And
Yes.
on the horse side, there's the concept of the three F's of horse welfare, which stand for freedom, friendship, and forage. And that's looking at those
Yes.
three
Yes.
things we've just talked about, turning them out, giving them a higher fiber diet, and making sure they've got
A
appropriate
pal or
social
two.
contact. A pal, a friend, exactly. And we see now, yeah, a lot more recommendations, guidance, webinars, discussion, and so on around the three Fs. And what I really think we're seeing, it has been traditional or common when we've had, for example, fatalities in high profile races for industry commentators to very quickly say these horses are treated like royalty. There's a narrative of them being
Right.
treated
Yes.
like royalty.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
I think there's we see challenge now and push back to that because as exactly as you've just said, it might be we might regard them as royalty, we might think we're treating them as royalty, but my goodness, if you were in their shoes, you would
Yes.
choose to be treated in a very different way. And that's what we're starting
Exactly.
to.
And shoeing doesn't even come into it. A whole nother issue of what is that experience like for a horse? And no
Yeah.
one ever questions it. And you have a jockey, a famous British jockey, saying, "Oh, my horses had the greatest life ever." Let's just say one thing about royalty. How many people would actually like to be royalty? Stop and think. Is that a life you actually want? Even as a
Mm.
human, it's really
Mm.
limiting. It's really without freedom. It's really without friends, guys. So saying this, some animal is treated like royalty would compare it to human royals. And I think that it's a really hard and probably mostly very difficult job. And lonely, and you're probably hungry a lot of the time because you can't even eat when you want to. Whole nother story. Sean, I'd love for you to read this little passage I pulled out from a chapter called Skylarks and Sheep, because if we have time, I want to talk about sheep too, and how much they are in physical distress and nobody addresses it with their lameness, but also in the way that their tails are docked. Just simple things that, from a veterinarian's perspective, you say, there's another way to do this. We don't have to do what we're doing. And your description of these little lambs when their tails are being docked with a tight elastic and the way your descriptions are great. They're not cringy as a reader. They're like, oh my God, didn't anybody but Dr. Wensley notice this poor little sheep couldn't take 3 steps without panicking? And the mother's upset. But this is what we do. It's how we do things. And there are better ways to do things. The great passages of writing in the book are about birds because they're clearly your first love and they bring out the poet in you. So if you would just read this bit about skylarks, it's very beautiful, and I hope will encourage people to get Through a Vet's Eyes, which isn't published in America, but through Blackwell you can get it without any shipping fee. And I'll make sure there's a link with the show so you can get it. I just recommend it so much, especially to anybody in the veterinary field or in any of these areas where these animals are owned and could be owned in a different way. So let's jump into you walking in the pine forest.
Okay, thank you. I walk with the dark strip of young pine trees screening out the rifle range on my left, and then from high above the plowed field ahead, faint hurrying stream of piccolo notes meets me on the path. They infiltrate me with their hypnotic constancy and pull me closer until I'm beneath my first singing skylark of the spring, transfixed and seared by his merciless beam of joyful optimism. The bird bubbles through his chosen champagne sky, fluting vertically high above his territory. As a spider conjures a web from its liquid silk, so the singing skylark, producing multiple notes a second, weaves an imaginary chord from his, hauling himself up it higher and higher, till it is barely possible to detect him as a speck in the sky above. And still he sings. The energy, rapidity, and unpredictability of his song are mesmerizing and helter-skelter around the DNA of every cell in my body. The bird lifts on endlessly beating wings, occasionally pausing before his next determined ascent. In a woodland, tens of species would be pouring their song into the fresh morning air. But above farmland, equivalent expectation and ability musters from 360 degrees of open sky and channels through the throat of a single sparrow-sized chorister with the ferocity of a great whale's blow. The skylark's ascent resuscitates the winter-wearied countryside. Red admirals make territorial sallies in woodland glades, while ponds and pools fill with reflections of emerging foliage. Between each pause of the bird's reviving song flight, flushes of colour return to the hedgerows and delicate eyelashes of Queen Anne's lace flutter in the country lanes as the land reawakens. At the peak of his ascent, the skylark spreads his wings one last time and parachutes to earth, enshrouded by the dazzling apparel of his unfaltering music. Once he's on the ground, I watch through binoculars as he looks around, seeking the approval of an unrevealed choreographer. Nearby reed bunting emits his single note song, resigned to life in a lyrical hinterland.
It's so beautiful. The veterinary world and the animal world definitely has benefited from your wisdom and your vision and your knowledge all these years, but I feel like there's so many books that are in you that are just about the beauty of nature, and particularly the description of birds and bird song and bird wing and the sky and the earth. I think the book really helps us to pay so much closer attention to the beauty as well as to some of the sadness of kept animals. And as you said, you're eternally optimistic and you do see improvements. And I haven't heard about the three F's in the horse world, but I haven't been actively in the horse world for a while. But I think that simply the awareness, particularly it can we'd hope we always say the younger generation should know, and the younger generation, which we were once, they're going to make a difference and they're going to make a change. I'm not sure. I think it's the graybeards that suddenly realize, oh my God, what have we been doing all these years? Hang on, let me look into this. And then a man with your knowledge on so many levels says this is why this isn't right, but this could be better. So let's talk for we only have a few minutes left. Anyone who cares about sheep, and my friend Jill Jakes had a lovely little flock. Is it a flock of sheep? Oh God, I've
Ooh,
forgotten. A group of sheep,
yeah,
anyway. And they each
yeah.
had names like, I don't know, Mozart or something. And they were
Mm,
fiber animals and they were kept as pets and they were all vastly overweight, which was not good for them, but she fed them copiously. And
mm,
they were lame a lot. And she was having the vet come all the time. And I thought, this is just sheer madness because when I had a house in Tuscany, there was my neighbor had a little flock of sheep. And he would bring them over to graze on my land. And I said, of course, saves me from having to scythe it or something. And he would leave me some ricotta from time to time, made from the sheep's milk, which was greatly appreciated. The sheep were all lame, Sean. And
mm.
I once said to him, not to be the pushy American living in the peasant land. Gee, they look like their feet are sore. No, that's just sheep. Don't worry about it. So, in just
Mm.
1 minute that's left, should we be paying more attention to sheep's lameness and soreness? Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Sheep are also underrated and they're often dismissed as stupid. So I spend quite
Yes.
a bit of
Yes,
time
you
just at
do.
the beginning of the chapter
Yes,
really laying out how intelligent they are and
that's
what
right.
studies of their cognitive
Yes.
ability show us their ability to recognize not only other sheep as individuals, but many different people, the
Yes.
emotions of those people.
Yes.
They remember them for many years. So if I think we need to make sure that no one is dismissing them on the grounds that they're daft or stupid.
Exactly. I hope
Um,
we have run out of time, and I just
okay.
hope that this little teaser will make you realize that this celebration of all these animals is there along with a concern about how we keep them and how we could do better. Through a Vet's Eyes, it's really a wonderful book, and you can go back to it from time to time and just read the beautiful lyrical passages about birds. That's much easier to read than straight up poetry, which I always find baffling. It's a beautiful book, Sean, and you've done an amazing job on behalf of all the animals who you care about and who we now care about more because of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.